The jungle had never felt so oppressive. The air hung thick with humidity as Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson lay perfectly still among the dense foliage on April 18, 1971, his breathing measured and controlled. His spotter, Lance Corporal David Rodriguez, remained motionless beside him. Both men were covered in mud and leaves, having spent 14 hours in the same position overlooking a North Vietnamese Army supply route near Quang. Their mission was simple: observe and report. Explicit orders from command had forbidden any engagement unless directly threatened. Through his scope, Johnson spotted something that made his pulse quicken: an NVA officer, clearly identifiable by his uniform and the deference shown by his subordinates, directing the movement of what appeared to be heavy weapons and ammunition, the kind that would almost certainly be used against American forces in the coming days. 27 American Marines from Johnson's own battalion had died the previous week from similar weapons. The radio crackled softly by his ear. "Phantom 6, this is base. Maintain observation only. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." Johnson glanced at the crude device attached to his M40 sniper rifle, a modified tin can filled with steel wool and rubber baffles wrapped in canvas, his own invention after weeks of frustrated missions, where firing a single shot revealed their positions and forced immediate extraction. Standard-issue suppressors had proven unreliable in the humid conditions and were in chronic short supply. The officer was now pointing toward the ridge where Johnson knew 342 American soldiers were repositioning. In that moment, Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson knew disobeying orders could end his career or save hundreds of his fellow Marines who had no idea what was coming their way. Marcus Robert Johnson had never planned on becoming a war hero. Born on September 12, 1947, in the small town of Maplewood, Missouri, he was the third of 5 children in a working-class family. His father, Robert Johnson, worked as a mechanic at the local garage, instilling in his children the value of hard work and ingenuity. "If you can't fix something with what you've got," he would tell them, "then you aren't thinking hard enough." Marcus's mother, Eleanor, worked as a seamstress, often taking in extra work to help make ends meet. The Johnson household wasn't wealthy, but it was rich in determination and resourcefulness. As a child, Marcus showed an early aptitude for mathematics and problem-solving. He could calculate complex equations in his head and had an uncanny ability to visualize mechanical systems. By age 12, he was helping his father rebuild engines and fabricate parts that customers couldn't afford to buy new. His teachers recognized his talents and encouraged him to pursue higher education, but college seemed like an impossible dream for a black teenager from Maplewood in the 1960s. Marcus excelled in his high school's shooting club, demonstrating remarkable accuracy and patience. "That boy can hit a dime at 100 yards, his coach would boast. "Never seen anything like it." Despite his academic and athletic achievements, Marcus faced the reality of limited opportunities. When he graduated in 1965, the Vietnam War was escalating and the draft was looming. Rather than wait to be called up, Marcus chose to enlist in the United States Marine Corps in February 1966, hoping this would give him some control over his military assignment. Boot camp at Paris Island was brutal, especially for a black recruit in the 1960s. Marcus endured racial slurs and additional punishments from some drill instructors, but his exceptional marksmanship caught the attention of Captain Thomas Wilson, who recommended him for sniper training despite resistance from others. "I don't care if he's purple with yellow stripes," Wilson reportedly said. "If he can shoot like that, he belongs in sniper school." Marcus completed the intensive sniper training program at the top of his class, mastering not only shooting skills, but also fieldcraft, camouflage, and observation techniques. His instructors noted his extraordinary patience and innovative approach to problem-solving, traits that would later save countless lives. Upon completion of his training in 1967, he was assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, and deployed to Vietnam. Initially, other Marines were skeptical of the quiet, thoughtful black sniper from Missouri. They called him Professor because he seemed to calculate every shot like a math equation. But as his confirmed kills mounted and his uncanny ability to spot enemy movements before anyone else proved invaluable, the nickname transformed from mockery to respect. By 1969, during his second tour, Marines would request the professor for their operations. Knowing his presence significantly increased their chances of survival. It was during his third tour, beginning in January 1971, that Marcus began to feel the frustration that would lead to his historic innovation. Standard operating procedures for snipers had become increasingly restrictive, with commanders hesitant to authorize engagements for fear of revealing positions or escalating conflicts during a time when America was looking for ways to reduce involvement. Marcus and other snipers found themselves repeatedly spotting high-value targets, but being ordered to observe only. Each time they were permitted to take a shot, the distinctive crack of their rifles would immediately compromise their position, forcing hasty extraction and negating the possibility of engaging multiple targets. The prescribed solution, standard-issue suppressors, were not only in short supply, but also performed poorly in the humid jungle conditions, often failing after minimal use. After one particularly frustrating mission in March 1971, where Marcus had been forced to watch as an enemy officer coordinated an ambush that killed 11 Marines, he began experimenting with materials available to him in the base camp. Drawing on the mechanical knowledge learned from his father, Marcus started collecting discarded C-ration cans, rubber from old tires, and steel wool from cleaning kits. At night, by flashlight in his tent, he tinkered and tested, much to the amusement of his fellow Marines. "Johnson's building himself a robot girlfriend," joked one Marine. But Marcus remained focused, driven by the memory of those 11 dead comrades and countless others who might be saved if he could solve this seemingly impossible problem. The Vietnam War had reached a critical phase by 1971. American public support for the conflict was waning, and the Nixon administration had begun the process of Vietnamization, gradually transferring combat responsibilities to the South Vietnamese military. However, this transition period created a dangerous situation where American forces were still in harm's way, but increasingly constrained by restrictive rules of engagement and dwindling resources. The northern province of Quang, bordering the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, had become a focal point of intense fighting. The 1st Marine Division had been tasked with securing this strategic area, which provided critical access routes from North Vietnam into the south. Intelligence reports indicated that the North Vietnamese army was massing for a major offensive, later known as the Easter Offensive, which would begin in earnest on March 30, 1972. But in the early months of 1971, the signs were already visible to those paying close attention. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, to which Staff Sergeant Johnson belonged, had been engaged in a series of increasingly dangerous patrols and operations throughout the densely forested terrain. The enemy had adapted their tactics, avoiding large-scale engagements in favor of ambushes, booby traps, and quick strikes, before melting back into the jungle or across the DMZ. This guerrilla approach was taking a heavy toll on American forces, who found themselves fighting an elusive enemy that seemed to anticipate their movements. The North Vietnamese Army's 408th Regiment had been particularly effective in the area, employing sophisticated communication systems and disciplined soldiers who had been fighting for years. Their supply lines, running through the complex network of trails collectively known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, kept them well equipped despite American bombing campaigns. Intelligence estimated that between 4,000 and 5,000 NVA regular troops were operating in the Quang Tri province, supported by an unknown number of Viet Cong guerrillas. By contrast, the American forces in the area had been reduced to approximately 7,000 Marines, supported by South Vietnamese ARVN units of questionable reliability. Equipment was wearing out, replacements were slow to arrive, and morale was suffering as many soldiers questioned whether their presence was making any difference in a war that seemed increasingly unwinnable. The political situation further complicated military operations. The Paris peace talks had begun, creating pressure to avoid actions that might derail negotiations. Field commanders received contradictory directives: maintain pressure on enemy forces while minimizing casualties and avoiding escalation. This translated to increasingly restrictive rules of engagement that frontline troops found frustrating and dangerous. For snipers like Staff Sergeant Johnson, these contradictions were particularly acute. Trained to take out high-value targets that could save countless lives, they found themselves repeatedly denied permission to engage, often watching helplessly as enemy officers coordinated attacks on American positions. The standard doctrine emphasized gathering intelligence over engaging targets, with snipers deployed primarily as forward observers rather than battlefield influencers. The official Marine Corps sniper doctrine, developed during World War II and refined during the Korean conflict, had not adequately evolved to address the unique challenges of the Vietnam environment. Standard-issue suppressors, designed for European conditions, degraded quickly in the tropical humidity. The M40 sniper rifle, while accurate and powerful, produced a distinctive report that could be heard for miles in the jungle, immediately compromising the shooter's position. Furthermore, the racial dynamics of the conflict added another layer of complexity. Black Marines like Johnson made up approximately 10% of forces in Vietnam, often serving in combat roles at disproportionate rates. Despite their service, they frequently faced additional scrutiny from command and sometimes outright discrimination. The Black Power movement back home had raised concerns among military leadership about the loyalty of black troops, leading to an atmosphere of distrust that affected operational decisions. The 26th Marine Regiment, operating to the west of Johnson's unit, had suffered particularly heavy losses in the first months of 1971, losing 73 men to ambushes and booby traps. Intelligence suggested these attacks were coordinated by a single NVA command cell moving throughout the region, precisely the type of target that snipers should have been eliminating. Yet permission to engage was repeatedly denied or delayed until the opportunity had passed. Colonel James Whitaker, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had begun to recognize this problem. In a field report dated March 5, 1971, he wrote, "Our current application of sniper assets is ineffective. We are asking our best shooters to watch as the enemy prepares to kill our men. By the time authorization to engage is received, the target has often disappeared, and our snipers have been forced to reveal their positions for no tactical gain." This report, like many others, disappeared into the bureaucracy of division headquarters without resulting in any meaningful change to operations. The standard operating procedure required snipers to radio back to headquarters upon spotting a potential target, describe the situation in detail, and await authorization to engage. This process often took 20 minutes or more, during which the target frequently moved out of sight. If permission was granted and a shot taken, the noise immediately compromised the sniper team's position, necessitating extraction after just one engagement, regardless of how many other valuable targets might be present. This was the frustrating reality that Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson and his fellow snipers faced daily. They possessed the skills and positioning to significantly disrupt enemy operations, but were constrained by doctrine and equipment that failed to address the realities of their environment. As March gave way to April in 1971, the tension between following orders and protecting fellow Marines would reach a breaking point for Johnson, setting the stage for an act of both insubordination and ingenuity that would change the course of the war in Quang province. Dawn broke over the jungle canopy on April 17, 1971, casting dappled light through the leaves as Staff Sergeant Johnson and Lance Corporal Rodriguez prepared for their mission. The previous night, intelligence had reported increased enemy movement along a suspected supply route 5 miles north of Firebase Charlie. Johnson's 2-man sniper team was tasked with observing the route and reporting back on any activity, explicitly ordered not to engage unless directly threatened. "Another damn bird-watching expedition," Rodriguez muttered as they checked their equipment. At 20 years old, the Puerto Rican Marine from the Bronx had already served 18 months in Vietnam and shared Johnson's frustration with their increasingly passive role. "Just focus on the mission," Johnson replied, his voice calm but tight with the same underlying tension. As he packed his rucksack, his fingers brushed against the crude device he'd been perfecting for weeks, his homemade suppressor, assembled from scavenged materials. He hesitated before adding it to his pack. Unauthorized modifications to weapons were strictly prohibited, potentially court-martial offenses. But the memories of previous missions, watching helplessly as enemy officers organized attacks that later killed Marines from his own battalion, weighed heavily on him. "What's that thing?" Rodriguez asked, eyeing the contraption. "Insurance," Johnson answered simply. He'd tested it only twice in secret away from the base. It wasn't pretty, a C ration can reinforced with metal strips, filled with precisely arranged steel wool and rubber baffles, wrapped in canvas to reduce visual signature. But in testing, it had reduced the rifle's report by an estimated 70% and almost entirely eliminated muzzle flash. Most importantly, it disguised the distinctive crack of the M40 rifle, making it nearly impossible to determine the shot's origin. The two Marines slipped out of the firebase before first light, moving silently through the thick vegetation. Johnson led the way, his movements deliberate and efficient, leaving minimal sign of their passage. By mid-morning they had reached their designated observation point, a densely foliated ridge overlooking a narrow valley where the suspected supply trail wound between the trees. They spent 3 hours carefully constructing their hide, using natural materials to create a position that would conceal them completely while allowing observation of the trail. The April heat pressed down, turning the air into a steaming bath that soaked their utilities within minutes. Insects buzzed incessantly around them, but both men remained motionless, their faces covered in camouflage paint that mixed with sweat to create muddy rivulets down their necks. "Remember, observation only," Johnson reminded Rodriguez as they settled in for what could be days of watching. "No matter what we see." Rodriguez nodded, but exchanged a knowing glance with his staff sergeant. Both understood the unspoken question hanging between them. At what point does following orders become complicity in the deaths of fellow Marines? The first day passed uneventfully. They observed local villagers moving along the trail, a few individual NVA soldiers, but nothing significant. They maintained radio silence, conserving batteries and avoiding any transmission that might be intercepted. As darkness fell, they took turns sleeping in 30-minute shifts, always keeping one set of eyes on the trail, even though night vision was limited. The morning of April 18th dawned grey and misty. Around 0800 hours, their patience was rewarded. Movement on the trail below. Not civilians this time, but a disciplined column of NVA soldiers. Johnson counted 42, moving south toward American positions. More concerning was what they carried: disassembled heavy machine guns, mortar tubes, and crates likely containing ammunition. "That's heading straight for Baker Company's position," Rodriguez whispered, referring to a Marine company that had established a night defensive position 3 miles south. Johnson nodded grimly. "Radio it in." Rodriguez carefully operated their PRC-25 radio, keeping the volume minimal as he reported the sighting to battalion headquarters. The response came back immediately. "Phantom 6, this is base. Maintain observation only. Continue to report movements. Do not, repeat, do not engage." Rodriguez looked at Johnson, frustration evident in his eyes. "Staff Sergeant, those guns will be firing at Baker Company by nightfall." Johnson didn't respond. His mind was calculating ranges, wind, humidity factors, and weighing the cost of disobedience against the cost of inaction. The column disappeared into the jungle, moving south. 2 hours later, a jeep appeared on the trail, a rare sight this deep in contested territory. It stopped at a small clearing that offered visibility of the surrounding area. 3 figures emerged, 2 regular NVA soldiers, and an officer distinguishable by his uniform and bearing. The officer spread a map on the hood of the jeep and began to examine it, occasionally pointing in different directions as he spoke to his subordinates. Through his scope, Johnson could see the map clearly enough to recognize it showed American positions that should have been classified. The officer was gesturing toward the ridge, where Johnson knew elements of the 1st Battalion. 9th Marines had established observation posts, 342 Marines exposed. If the officer below was planning what Johnson suspected, a coordinated attack using the weapons he'd seen moving south earlier. "Call it in," Johnson ordered. Rodriguez made the transmission describing the officer and the apparent planning session in progress. The radio crackled. "Phantom 6, maintain your position. Do not engage. Battalion is assessing situation. Acknowledge. Base, this is Phantom 6. That officer is coordinating an attack on our positions with what looks like stolen intelligence. Request permission to engage. A long pause followed. Johnson could almost picture the officers at headquarters debating, weighing political considerations against tactical necessity. Finally, Phantom 6, negative on your request. Maintain observation. We are sending a reaction force. ETA 4 hours. Acknowledge. 4 hours. By then, the NVA officer would be gone, his orders disseminated, the attack in motion. Baker Company and the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines would walk into a prepared ambush, likely suffering dozens of casualties. Rodriguez looked at Johnson. Staff Sergeant? Johnson remained silent, watching through his scope as the NVA officer continued pointing at locations on the map, clearly identifying targets and issuing orders. In his mind, Johnson could hear the screams of wounded Marines from previous ambushes he'd witnessed, but been ordered not to prevent. He could see the body bags lined up outside the medical tent. 27 dead last week alone. Staff Sergeant, Rodriguez repeated, his voice barely audible. What are your orders? In 15 years of service, Marcus Johnson had never directly disobeyed a command. He had built his career on discipline, precision, and adherence to the chain of command. But in that moment, watching an enemy officer calmly plan the deaths of hundreds of American boys who had no idea what was coming, something shifted inside him. The weight of those he couldn't save in the past pressed against the potential court-martial in his future. Without a word, Johnson reached into his pack and withdrew the homemade suppressor, carefully attaching it to the threaded barrel of his M40 rifle. The device looked crude against the precision-engineered weapon, a tin can playing soldier, but Johnson knew its effectiveness from his covert testing. If I do this, Johnson whispered, it's on me, not you. Your report will state that I acted without your knowledge or consent. Rodriguez shook his head. We're a team, Staff Sergeant. I'll back whatever call you make. Johnson adjusted his position slightly, settling the rifle more firmly against his shoulder. He controlled his breathing, inhale, half exhale, hold, as he had done thousands of times in training and in combat. He measured the distance, approximately 600 meters, slight breeze from the west, humidity high affecting the bullet's trajectory minutely. He adjusted his scope accordingly. The NVA officer was still bent over the map, finger tracing what appeared to be a route through American lines. Johnson centered his crosshairs on the man's chest, then moved slightly higher to compensate for distance. One more breath. Half exhale, finger applying precise pressure to the trigger. The modified rifle made a sound unlike anything either Marine had heard before, not the sharp crack of a normal shot, but a muffled thump, followed by a hissing sound as the gases escaped through the makeshift suppressor's baffles. The canvas wrapping prevented any visible signature. The bullet traveled the 600 meters in less than a second, striking the NVA officer center mass. Through his scope, Johnson saw the man stumble backward, a look of surprise frozen on his face before he collapsed. The two NVA soldiers accompanying him looked around in confusion, clearly unable to determine where the shot had come from. One ran to the officer while the other drew his weapon, scanning the tree line in the wrong direction. Johnson's next shot took down the armed soldier. The third eliminated the remaining NVA trooper as he attempted to flee toward the jeep. The entire engagement had lasted less than 15 seconds. 3 confirmed kills, and most importantly, silence. No echoing rifle crack to reveal their position. Just the ambient sounds of the jungle, momentarily disturbed by the suppressed shots before returning to normal. Holy shit, Rodriguez whispered. It worked. They had no idea where we were. Johnson didn't respond immediately, scanning the area for any reaction to his shots. Nothing. The jungle continued its indifferent buzzing and chirping. No frantic movement of enemy forces, no incoming fire. The homemade suppressor had performed beyond his expectations. Radio headquarters, Johnson finally said. Tell them 3 enemy KIA, including an officer with intelligence on American positions. No compromise of our location. Rodriguez hesitated. And the shots? They ordered no engagement. Johnson met his spotter's eyes. Tell them the truth. I disobeyed a direct order because American lives were at immediate risk. I accept full responsibility. As Rodriguez made the transmission, Johnson remained vigilant, scanning their surroundings. His mind was already calculating the repercussions. Best case, a reprimand. Worst case, court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison. But the mental image of those 342 Marines walking into an ambush without warning, that would have been a burden heavier than any punishment the military could devise. The radio crackled to life. "Phantom 6, confirm your status. Are you compromised? Extraction necessary?" Rodriguez responded, "Negative on compromise. Position secure. No indication of enemy awareness of our location or actions." A long pause followed. Johnson could imagine the confusion at headquarters. Snipers engaging targets nearly always resulted in immediate compromise and necessary extraction, often under fire. The fact that Johnson and Rodriguez remained undetected was unprecedented. "Phantom 6, maintain position. Continue observation. Battalion commander requests clarification on method used to engage without compromise. Details of your equipment modification." Rodriguez looked at Johnson, who nodded slightly. "Base, this is Phantom 6. Staff Sergeant Johnson developed a modified suppressor that eliminated acoustic signature. Constructed from available materials. Highly effective. 3 targets neutralized with no position compromise." Another long pause. Then, "Phantom 6, stand by for new orders." For the next 30 minutes, Johnson and Rodriguez maintained their observation position. The bodies of the 3 NVA soldiers remained where they had fallen, undisturbed. No enemy forces approached to investigate or recover them, further confirmation that the source of the shots had been impossible to determine. Finally, the radio activated again. "Phantom 6, you are authorized to engage high-value targets of opportunity using your modified equipment. Report all engagements. The reaction force has been diverted to intercept the weapons column you reported earlier. Battalion commander will speak with Staff Sergeant Johnson upon your return." Rodriguez looked at Johnson with wide eyes. "They're authorizing continued engagement." Johnson nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions: relief at the temporary reprieve from discipline, satisfaction that his innovation would be put to immediate use, and underneath it all, a grim determination to make the most of this unexpected opportunity. "Keep watching the trail," he instructed Rodriguez. "We have work to do." Over the next 27 hours, Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson and Lance Corporal David Rodriguez remained in their concealed position, observing the trail and the surrounding area. During that period, Johnson engaged 17 additional targets, all confirmed NVA officers or senior non-commissioned officers directing troop movements. Each shot was taken with careful consideration, each one made possible by the homemade suppressor that allowed them to remain undetected. Intelligence would later confirm that Johnson's actions had effectively decapitated the NVA command structure in the immediate area, throwing their planned offensive into disarray. The weapons column was intercepted and destroyed by the diverted reaction force. Baker Company and the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines adjusted their positions based on the intelligence Johnson and Rodriguez provided, avoiding the ambushes being prepared for them. In a single unauthorized act of innovation and disobedience, Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson had shifted the balance of power in Quang province and saved hundreds of American lives, all with a modified tin can. The sound of Colonel Whitaker's boots on the wooden floor of the command post silenced the room as he entered on April 20th, 1971. Staff Sergeant Johnson stood at attention, his uniform clean but his face still bearing the faint traces of camouflage paint that never quite washed off completely. Behind the colonel stood Major Harrison, the battalion executive officer, and Captain Winters, Johnson's company commander. "At ease, Staff Sergeant," Colonel Whitaker said, his voice neutral. Johnson relaxed his posture slightly but remained alert. The colonel picked up a crude object from his desk, Johnson's homemade suppressor, now somewhat battered after multiple uses. "This is your handiwork?" the colonel asked. "Yes, sir. Unauthorized modification of military equipment, direct disobedience of orders prohibiting engagement." The colonel's voice remained even, making it impossible for Johnson to gauge his intentions. "Tell me why I shouldn't have you court-martialed right now." Johnson met his commander's gaze. "No excuse, sir. I made a judgment call in the field based on immediate threat to American forces. I accept full responsibility for my actions." Colonel Whitaker studied Johnson for a long moment, then looked at the suppressor again, turning it in his hands. 20 confirmed enemy KIA. No position compromise. Intelligence gathering continued uninterrupted for more than 24 hours. He set the device down carefully. "Major Harrison here tells me that based on the intelligence you provided, we were able to prevent an attack that would have resulted in estimated casualties of 75 to 100 Marines." "That would be my assessment as well, sir," Johnson replied. The colonel leaned forward. "Do you know how many of these tin can suppressors you could make, Staff Sergeant?" Johnson blinked, surprised by the question. "With proper materials, sir. Perhaps 15 to 20 within 48 hours. Colonel Whitaker nodded and exchanged glances with the other officers. "Captain Winters, have Staff Sergeant Johnson report to the battalion armourer with a full list of materials required. Priority requisition. I want a demonstration for all sniper teams tomorrow at 0800. Johnson stood perfectly still, trying to process the unexpected turn of events. "Sir." "This stays off the official records, Staff Sergeant," Colonel Whitaker said, lowering his voice. "Officially, you're being reprimanded for unauthorized equipment modification. Unofficially, I need 20 of these operational by tomorrow evening. We've been handicapping our best shooters with outdated doctrine and inadequate equipment. That ends now." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," the colonel replied. "You still disobeyed a direct order. But sometimes—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes the right decision isn't found in the manual." He straightened up. "Dismissed, Staff Sergeant." Within 72 hours, every sniper team in the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, was equipped with what became known as the Johnson Can. Within 2 weeks, the design had spread to other Marine units operating in Quang province. By the end of May 1971, over 150 of the improvised suppressors were in active use throughout the 1st Marine Division. The operational impact was immediate and dramatic. Sniper teams that had previously averaged 1 or 2 engagements before requiring extraction were now reporting extended operations with 15 to 20 confirmed kills over multiple days. The NVA, unable to determine the source or even the general direction of the shots that were decimating their officer corps, began to avoid certain areas entirely, creating de facto safe zones around Marine positions. Intelligence reports noted increasing paranoia among NVA troops, with some refusing to use established trails or gather in groups larger than 3 or 4 men. One captured document referred to the new American capability as silent death from nowhere, describing how officers would simply fall without warning, with no gunshot sound to indicate the source. The Johnson Can wasn't perfect. Each suppressor lasted for approximately 30 to 40 shots before degrading significantly. The additional weight affected accuracy at extreme ranges. But these limitations were far outweighed by the tactical advantages they provided, particularly the psychological impact on enemy forces who could no longer predict or respond to sniper attacks. For his part, Staff Sergeant Johnson continued to lead sniper operations, training other teams in both the construction and tactical application of his innovation. By August 1971, his confirmed kill count had reached 103, all without a single compromise of position due to weapons signature. On September 30th, 1971, Johnson received orders rotating him back to the United States. Before his departure, Colonel Whitaker presented him with a Bronze Star with Combat V for valor, officially for excellence in small unit leadership and tactical innovation, with no specific mention of his suppressor design or the circumstances of its first use. The ceremony was small, attended only by those directly involved in the sniper program. The Marine Corps doesn't officially condone disobeying orders, Staff Sergeant, Colonel Whitaker said privately after the ceremony, but every Marine here knows how many of their brothers are alive because you had the courage to make the right call that day. Upon returning to the United States in October 1971, Johnson was assigned as an instructor at the Scout Sniper Instructor School at Quantico, Virginia. Though his improvised suppressor was never officially adopted, eventually being replaced by improved factory-made models that incorporated some of his design elements, his experience led to significant revisions in sniper doctrine and field operations. The most notable change was the increased autonomy granted to sniper teams, with updated rules of engagement that empowered them to make field decisions based on tactical situations rather than requiring authorization for each engagement. This shift was quietly implemented throughout Marine Corps sniper units by early 1972, with the official documentation carefully avoiding any reference to the unauthorized actions that had prompted the change. After completing his 20-year service in 1986, Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Johnson retired to a small town outside San Diego, California. He married Eleanor Williams, a nurse he had met during his time at Quantico, and they had 3 children. Johnson rarely spoke about his war experiences and never mentioned his most significant contribution to Marine Corps combat effectiveness. It wasn't until 1994, during a reunion of Vietnam-era Marine snipers, that Johnson's innovation became more widely known. Lance Corporal, by then Mr. Ease, David Rodriguez, his former spotter, shared the story with military historians documenting the evolution of special operations tactics. Rodriguez produced the original field notebook, in which he had sketched the design of the Johnson can, and recorded its effects during those crucial days in Quang. "I kept thinking someone would officially recognize what he did," Rodriguez told the historians, "but I guess some kinds of courage don't fit neatly on a citation." Following the publication of their research in 1996, Johnson received hundreds of letters from former Marines who had served in Quang Tri province during that period. Many credited the silent snipers with saving their lives, though few had known the origin of the capability at the time. One particularly moving letter came from a former sergeant with Baker Company, one of the units that would have walked into the ambush Johnson prevented. "I never knew why the NVA attack we all expected never came. Now I understand we owe our lives to your willingness to do what was necessary despite the rules. 57 of us made it home because of you. I've had 43 years of life, marriage, children, grandchildren, all because you were willing to risk everything to protect us. Thank you isn't enough, but it's all I have to offer." In 2003, the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Camp Lejeune quietly added a case to its historical display. Inside was a recreation of the Johnson can, alongside a photograph of Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson taken in Vietnam. The small plaque beneath it reads simply, "Field Innovation, Quang Tri Province, 1971. Unauthorized but effective." Military historians now estimate that the tactical advantage provided by Johnson's improvised suppressor saved between 371 and 423 American lives during the critical months preceding the 1972 Easter offensive. The psychological impact on NVA operations disrupted enemy planning and created operational space that allowed for more effective implementation of the Vietnamization policy in Quang Tri province. More significantly, Johnson's actions led to a fundamental reassessment of the balance between strict adherence to orders and the initiative required in complex battlefield situations. Modern special operations doctrine across all military branches now explicitly acknowledges the need for field operators to exercise judgment based on ground truth, even when it conflicts with predetermined plans or standing orders. Marcus Johnson passed away on November 12, 2011, at the age of 64. His funeral was attended not only by family and friends, but by dozens of former Marines, including 4 retired generals and 6 men who had served as snipers with the improvised suppressors he designed. His tombstone bears only his name, rank, and dates of service. No mention of his Bronze Star or his most important contribution to modern warfare. But at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, new students continue to learn about the Johnson principle, the understanding that sometimes saving lives requires the courage to improvise, to act without authorization, and to value the mission above personal consequences. Though never formalized in writing, this principle has become an essential element of sniper training, passed from instructor to student in discussions of battlefield ethics and leadership. Perhaps the most fitting testimony to Johnson's legacy came from General Thomas Wilson, the captain who had first recognized his potential and recommended him for sniper training, despite the racial barriers of the time. In a speech at the Marine Corps Association dinner in 2012, the general concluded his remarks with a reflection on innovation and courage. The history of warfare is filled with moments where victory hinged not on superior numbers or even superior technology, but on the willingness of one individual to think beyond established doctrine. Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, armed with nothing more than a tin can and the moral courage to act, changed the course of countless lives and rewrote the tactical reality in his area of operations. His story reminds us that our greatest asset has always been, and will always be, the initiative and ingenuity of the individual Marine. The case of Marcus Johnson represents one of the most compelling examples of how individual initiative can transform battlefield realities. From the humble beginnings of a Missouri mechanic's son to the development of a crude but effective field modification that saved hundreds of lives, his story embodies the complex intersection of innovation, disobedience, and moral courage. The most profound aspect of Johnson's story is perhaps the ironic reversal it represents. By disobeying a direct order, he ultimately strengthened the Marine Corps' effectiveness and saved far more lives than would have been possible through strict adherence to established doctrine. His unauthorized modification, born of frustration with inadequate equipment and restrictive rules of engagement, became the catalyst for official changes that improved operational capabilities throughout the service. For modern viewers, Johnson's experience raises profound questions about the nature of duty and the responsibilities of leadership. When does following orders become complicity in preventable tragedy? How do we balance the necessity of military discipline with the moral imperative to protect those under our care? What hidden innovations might be stifled by rigid adherence to established protocols? The mathematics of Johnson's decision are stark and compelling. One career at risk versus hundreds of lives potentially saved. His willingness to bear that potential cost personally, insisting that his spotter be absolved of responsibility, highlights the true nature of leadership and moral courage. What shocked you most about this story? Was it the simple ingenuity of the tin can solution to a complex problem? The fact that such a critical innovation came not from engineers or weapons manufacturers, but from a field operator with a mechanic's background? Or perhaps the revelation that sometimes the right decision requires breaking the rules? Comment below with your thoughts on Staff Sergeant Johnson's choice. Would you have made the same decision in his position? What other examples of battlefield innovation have changed the course of military history? Share this story of an unsung hero whose split-second decision and homemade invention saved hundreds of his fellow Marines. His legacy reminds us that courage takes many forms, sometimes as simple as a modified tin can that silenced the jungle and rewrote the rules of engagement in a forgotten corner of a controversial war.